And so I'll show you a few examples of what the students have produced to try to share with each other what they think are the similarities and the differences. And so to get to that point, it will look like a lot of the same material, but on purpose, because we have the computer scientists trying to speak neurophysiology and the neurophysiologist trying to speak computer science. Because we tend to treat them as two different languages in the US universities. And oftentimes the people don't know how to communicate with each other. So we tried to force them to learn the common language between them. To get to that, I wanted to give a bit of background as to why we're even looking into this space. And this is where the philosophy, I guess, comes in. So if we have these smart devices that we're designing and wanting humans to use, we expect that the device will be responsive to what the human wants, right? So forget about all the challenges we've been talking about, well, it doesn't know if it's a stair or a ramp or what. Let's assume that it's perfect and it knows exactly what you want to do. So it's so smart that you don't even have to think about it, perhaps, right? But all of the things we've been talking about is the device needs to be able to understand the human intent to be able to do what the human wants it to do. Because otherwise you have an over-designed system that you just have to sit on top of and drive you around. So maybe that's a fully autonomous vehicle, right? You don't have to think about the car or where to drive it. You just get in and say, I want dinner. And it takes you to dinner somehow, magically, right? So that's one idea that people have been talking about with assistive devices. This should be something that's so smooth that the human doesn't even have to think about it anymore. And that's a nice idea for sure. But that requires the device to be really smart and really adaptive to what the human actually needs to happen. So it's not just one recipe or one equation that always produces the same output. So then we're thinking about this though, that if you have a really smart device and it makes an adaptation to account for what the human wants it to do, if the human is still somewhat in control of the device, the human also has the ability still to adapt. So let's say I put on a new limb and I start walking around with it. It goes up the stairs well, but I've had 30 years of walking on a limb that was passive and had no smart capability at all. It will be surprising to me to have a limb that functions so well. And in response to that, I might think about changing the way I use that limb based on the fact that my motor adaptation will realize there's something different going on, and I might adapt basically away from that. So then what does the system do? If it sees me pulling away from it, does it respond the same way? Or does it come to meet me? Or do I need to chase after it? So you end up having kind of a relationship between the human motor control approach and the machine adaptation approach. So this has begun making us think about the idea that you can have basically overlapping cycles. So you can have a human motor learning cycle, and we'll talk about kind of some common ways to assess that. And then also an error correction cycle within the machine interface. And then where they interface is an opportunity for some really interesting science to come out, where you can look at human-machine co-adaptation or kind of co-evolution a little bit. Another model would be symbiotic relationship in nature. So talking about biomimetic systems, if you have two organisms or two species that work well with each other, it becomes a symbiotic relationship, and they both benefit from that. So it's hard to necessarily describe what the computer will benefit from this relationship, besides the fact that we continue to plug it in to get charged and feed it electrons, I suppose. So maybe that's the benefit. But if we can benefit from having a good working relationship, then these expensive devices don't get hung up on the shelf after they stop working as we want them to. So this is an idea we're trying to play with in a mathematical construct, but this is a very simple model, right? Two circles overlapping, easy. Seems like it's already done. So we'll talk about today a little bit about what's going on inside the human motor learning side of it, and what we think is in common with what's going on in the machine learning side that can be an adaptive mechanism. So what we did a couple years back was to ask computer science students to explain to the neurophysiology student what is control theory. And then also to explain to the neurophysiology student, what is human motor learning? And then we asked the neurophysiology student to explain to the computer scientist what is human motor learning and explain to the computer scientist what is control theory, to see if they come up with the same answers or not. So it was an interesting kind of educational challenge to see if you can get two bright young individuals to explain to each other what their specialty is and what their other person's specialty is without talking to each other beforehand. And so I'm going to show you basically what the product of that little experiment was. So first, we had the computer scientist describing to us what they saw as control theory. And so this is a relatively simple structure, as you can see, where you have some stimulus or some input coming into a system that's embedded within a device. So some controller is making the decisions. And then it outputs some commands to a system that executes those instructions, right? And then likely this is all you need to generate some output. So for an example, the controller says, turn the light on. And so the system turns the light on, you see the light come on. It's nice and easy, right? But if I said turn the light on and make it red, but it actually came on green, then the sensor that's there would measure the result of the system's output and say, good job, you turned the light on, but it's the wrong color. So let's correct that. So the idea of a controller, a system, a sensor can all be then built into a nice little error correction loop, which is very simplistic, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes behind these, as you know. So with this, we broke it down a little bit further and had them describe, so what do you mean by a controller and embedded system? So this is their description. Then it begins by giving instructions to the system, telling it how to react to any situation. So if you can over-design it to be something that reacts to every situation, or you can design it heuristically to design or to react to types of situations. So then it begins to receive data as feedback from the sensor and make some adjustments and calculates whether the instruction needs to be changed or not. So it's not just telling the person or the system again and again and again, turn on the light. It's turn on the light with this spectrum, turn on the light with this energy range, turn on the light and pulse it with this frequency. So it gives more specific instructions. So potentially it gave those instructions on the front side of this loop, but more likely you have a system that can adapt and learn to give more information or different information to try to derive a system that outputs a more correct answer. So this is a fairly simple model, but can be built into a very complex model very quickly, depending on basically all the things that aren't drawn in here, which is all the error correction routines and all of the kind of heuristics that could be built into correction of the output. So one idea then he came up with from the computer science perspective is that the system itself is really just the thing that's receiving instructions and executing the commands. So it's a little bit the non-smart system of this smart system. It's just following orders, doesn't question what's going on, just does what's told. And so if you have garbage going into this system, you have garbage coming out, right? Then the sensor is also not a very smart thing. It's really just sensing a physical process that has occurred. You can make fairly complex networks of sensors, but each individual sensor is fairly dumb, right? It just detects the one thing it's supposed to, records it, and sends it back. So the controller is really where the brain of this system is, with maybe something that's not listed here, which is an error correction system to inform on the brain again. And we'll talk a little bit later about it in neurophysiology, where we think that actually is. It's not often talked about in control systems for computer science as being a necessary item to code for or to program for, but we think it might be necessary to start thinking about it that way. So the other thing the students wanted to make sure that we considered was that there's a variety of control system types based on this general simple design. Some of them are linear response and then nonlinear response. So similar to our machine learning approaches that we've talked about off and on, you can have a transformation function that's a linear response that just scales things up, or you can have a tangential sigmoid response. You can have functions that basically accelerate or inhibit that signal. And then also you can have multiple inputs or single inputs, and then single or multiple outputs. So obviously, you can make it a very simple thing or a very complex thing. So these are just some things to consider when designing any control system, because we often talk about, we try to design things to be as simple yet elegant as possible, so that you have a model that, with the simplest model, can describe the most about the physical parameter. And so in coding and in computer structuring, oftentimes it's also a good idea to save on your computational costs. And then this is an interesting question that often comes up, is closed versus open loop system. So what do we mean in that case? If it's a closed loop system, maybe it has no opportunity to receive extra information to correct along the way. But if it's an open loop system, that starts to get us intrigued that we could start to pull from some other source, in this case maybe the human, to have an extra part of the loop that brings some extra information in from some other control device, in this case the human. So when we started talking about, all right, how could we design a control system from a computer science perspective that actually was open to these other ideas, we started asking these kind of open-ended questions about what aspect do we want to actually control in the system, because you don't want a totally uncontrolled system, right? Chaos is interesting mathematically. It produces some cool data. We could look at fractal designs in these cases, I guess. But we started talking about, if we're doing a simple design, but we probably have a lot of control over the system, but do we really need full control? Or can we allow some vagaries in the control system that allow for more biological variation rather than strict coding of what we think should happen? And then what feedback are we actually observing? So are we observing the color of the light that was turned on? Are we observing the energy cost of driving that light? Are we observing the response of some other element in response to that light? So maybe this initial signal was to flash one light, but then what we're actually interested in is what the response is from the other plant. So the other system is actually picking up that signal from a distance and sending that sensor back to this. So that's an open loop system. It's also observation at a distance rather than just measuring internal. And this last thing, how robust is the system? That's kind of an open question as well, where it could be, how do you define robust? So if we want it to be something that works without failing, I consider that to be a robust thing. Worst case analysis, right? So you want something that will work all the time to some extent, but that could be the simplest design that isn't actually very interesting, right? It could be something that just flips on and off regularly, does its job, and it senses that it's flipping on and off regularly, doing its job. No problem, it's very robust for that task. But how much adaptation can you build into it and still have a robust system? So if it gets one aspect wrong, does it fail? Or does it just have an error? And can you correct that error? So then the way the computer science student described to us what they thought motor learning was, from a neurophysiology perspective, was this. So you can see it's at the front end a little bit similar to what the original control theory idea was. So you had a controller, you had a system, and you had a sensor. So in this case, they decided, well, I think there might be two sensors. There might be a sensor that's driven as the main learning and feedback tool. And then you have kind of maybe the straight sensor that's more of the standard control theory approach. So the way that they imagined this was that there's two things going on in parallel. So this might be the purely electrical circuit design of a control theory approach. And then this might be one that allows more of a machine learning approach to understand how neurophysiology works. So it was an interesting idea. This is just their idea. They didn't look up textbooks. They didn't look up what traditional definitions were. They just, from their understanding about what we said motor learning was this. So in this case, they built in also a learning controller in addition to the main controller. And so the idea here was that the system would put out some outputs, and the sensor would be focused on whether or not something needs to be learned or adjusted. There would be some storage in this cache here that would have stored information from the controller output and from the sensor input again. And then there would be some learning controller that would compare both the expected outcome versus the actual outcome, and then make some change. So this is not really very different from a lot of our machine learning approaches, right? You have some target, you have some train to that target, and then you compare target value to actual predicted value. It's off, so you make some error correction to adjust for that. So not anything super novel in that case.
The cache is a temporary storage.
The cache is a temporary storage in this case, which is another idea you can play with, is how long do you store that information? Do you store it in a one cycle per cycle session and then throw it away after you don't need it for that next cycle? Or do you store the last 10 cycles and have kind of a longer memory? So this is an interesting idea to get a computer scientist to generate something like this that they said, I think this is how the brain actually works. I think this is how motor learning actually works. So that was a fun example and experiment. So then they went through and listed out their motor learning principles as they had listed out their control theory principles. So I want you to hold on to these things because in a bit, I'm going to talk about what neurophysiologists think motor learning is. And I want you to think about how they're similar or not. So the computer scientists thought that motor learning principle from this design would be they compare results between expectations and reality. So that sounds like a nice thing, right? In general, you can do that. If it needs adjusting, then you can redefine the situation in response to the stimuli, not just readjust. So this was an interesting idea that we were surprised the computer scientists actually came up with, because we thought they would constrain themselves quite a bit more to just rules-based systems where you're just doing the error correction to the function. But they said not just readjust the value, but redefine the question, redefine the whole kind of judgment about whether that was good or bad or was the right value. And that it has to be an ongoing process to actually create kind of something that's permanent. So in other words, you don't continue to fiddle with it until it's always unstable. That you come up with a good way, it becomes the way, and then you hold on to that way. So this was an interesting idea for computer scientists to say, I don't think that as we learn to walk, we have to relearn to walk every morning. I think we remember how to walk from yesterday or from when we were 2 years old, right? It's like riding the bike. As soon as you get off the bike, any other time you get on the bike, you remember something about that. So their approach was that it seems like at some point we need to make a permanent result. But the key word here is relatively permanent, because we still need something to be adaptable in the face of an injury, in the face of a new terrain condition. So walking along here is not the same as walking over rough ground. But overall, it's the same, right? I just have some fine details to work out along the way. So then the decisions that they were asking about what would need to be done for the actual design in response to these things about how permanent or how much adjustment, how much correction needs to be implemented. So is it a huge correction or is it a very small finite correction? What is the determining factor to determine if it's actually a correct response? So who's the referee in this match that says, yes, that's the correct answer, or yes, that's a foul, don't do that anymore, do it this way instead. So what's the gold standard for this design? And then what process should benefit from the motor learning? So this is more of a task-oriented perspective. In the end, it's nice to understand if the system learns well and becomes a robust system, but what process actually benefits from that? So is it efficiency of movement? Is it the ability to walk and chew gum, right? Can you do something mechanically and not have to think about doing something else because it's just rolling without you having to think about it? Can you talk if you're on a conversation and do math in your head while also doing a mechanical task? So what's the process that actually needs to benefit from this motor learning? So a very functional perspective about what biologists often take for granted is just, it's a natural thing. It happens, you learn things, you adapt, and it just moves forward. So the computer scientist was trying to break it down into more of a mechanistic perspective. So then we heard from the neurophysiologist about their perspective. And so first, again, they defined their own area, and then they went into defining the computer science area. So the neurophysiology student decided instead to borrow quite a bit from their own notes and their own textbooks, which was kind of interesting to observe. So their description of motor learning as a definition, a relatively permanent change in the ability to execute a motor skill from practice or experience. So think about that for a little while. A relatively permanent change, that sounds like what the computer scientist was talking about, right? Once you get something good, it's relatively permanent, it stays there. but it's a relatively permanent change, meaning there was something before that. And the ability to execute the motor skill from either a lot of practice or some stored memories, some experience. So this starts to define things about you can practice a skill and acquire that skill within the time frame of just an hour or less, or you can remember how you did the skill last time you played tennis and come back and do that skill again. So then they also wanted to break down the stages of learning. It's not something that just happens kind of continuously. That with each new task, that there's a cognitive stage, an associative or a fixation stage, and an autonomous stage. So this is interesting to start using these terms because when we're starting to blend computer science that might encompass machine learning with physiology and that encompasses motor learning, we start to maybe share some terminology as well. So a cognitive stage, rather something where you have been instructed about how to do the task, and now you think about doing the task, and you're kind of incorporating what you already know with what you've been told about what you should be doing. The fixation and the associative is thought to be something where this is where you're actually storing the memories, maybe overnight, while you're sleeping, while you're going to your next class and wishing you were still playing tennis. You're going back through the ideas in your mind without even really realizing that you're fixating those memories into some long-term memory storage. And then autonomous stage is a nice idea, but we always wonder if it actually is true. So some motor learning things, probably yes. You don't have to think about how you're walking while you're walking. It becomes autonomous. And you can adjust your speed and you can look out for obstacles without having to necessarily think about it. But sometimes that system breaks and you have to actually start thinking about it again based on some injury or some neurological problem. And then at the end of all this, you can learn these things, but how do we actually measure the fact that you've learned them? So two very traditional ways to measure motor learning is can you perform the new task, and also can you retain the ability to perform that task later? So very traditionally, motor learning will often encompass the ability to acquire the new task, to then next day transfer it to a similar task that's a little bit harder, a little bit different, or retain the task days later. So this is a demonstration of learning. Otherwise, all you've done is demonstrate you can follow a pattern. And so if you've learned it, the idea is you've demonstrated later or in a different construct, a different setting. So if you've learned how to, we'll just continue with the tennis example for a while. You've learned how to do just a ground stroke. If you then go to play in a shorter field or in a racquetball court, can you still produce a ground stroke, even though it's not the tennis ground stroke? So that's a transfer, and you've retained it for a little bit later on. They also spread things across this continuum model of information processing, where you perceive things and sense them. You can then interpret what those sensations are. You can conceptualize what they are with respect to your map that you already have in your head. You can strategize and plan for how to fix the situation, and then you can execute some action. So this is a continuum approach, not a cycle approach, but this is often how motor learning is encompassed or described. And then to the EEG fans in the audience, there is also some description within the traditional motor learning about where in the cortical system these actually take place. So in perception, thought to be in the primary and secondary sensory cortices, the conceptualization or trying to make the map between interpretation of the plan and the parietal and temporal lobes, and then motor cortex for making the plan become an action. So this is generally thought to be where these processes are happening. So then there's been quite a bit of work in motor learning about demonstrating what's the best way to give feedback and use the feedback for internal and external validation of your idea. So the idea is that inside your brain, you have a model already in place for how you think things should go. And then it's whether or not you incorporate external information to confirm your internal model or update your internal model. So the idea of an internal model or internal map versus an external model or map has been talked about quite a bit recently. And then also the frequency of feedback is very important as well. So if the person is getting feedback once a week on this new task, or they're getting feedback every cycle of the new task and everything in between, can either drive the person into a bad habit for the new acquisition, or can make them very robust at performing that task. The ideas then about how do you practice these new devices or these new skills has been broken up into various things where you have the whole skill that's being performed, so the entire tennis stroke, or you have just part of the skill, like how to step and transfer your weight, how to actually raise the racket, how to actually snap the wrist. So you have parts of the skill that are learned and practiced, or you have the whole system that you practice. And so this kind of layers up the complexity of what the actual motor learning challenge is. If I just need to chain myself to do this, that's pretty easy. I can learn how to do that. But if I need to do that in concert with my arm motion and my weight transfer and the visualization of the ball and where it actually is going to go after I strike the ball, then I have the whole task, but 6 or 7 layers of complexity inside of that.
So when you consider such aspects, then you also think about the degree of freedom.
Whether you actually think about the degree of freedom. So I think as someone who's considering the implications of the two systems working together, you have to consider the degrees of freedom. In motor learning literature traditionally, it's not considered as an individual thing to be thought about or conceptualized. It's that the overall complexity of the task is greater. But the engineering mindset, we often then say complexity means more degrees of freedom, right? So these are more things you need to control. So yeah, that's a good question. So there's been a few other areas of research in this space that have happened for quite a while, since the 70s, where you can actually then give the person a task and randomize the difficulty of the task or the actual condition of the task. So if you can imagine, you just learned to shoot the basketball at the hoop, and you decide, I'm going to practice shooting free throws. So you stand in one place and just shoot free throws all day. So you get very good at that particular task. But if you step 3 feet to the side, on either side of the key, you may be the same distance from the basket, but not be as good at making the basket. So this allows you some variety that you have to then train within to have a robust system. And so some of the ideas have been generated about whether you practice at one spot for 20 shots, and then go to the other spot for 20 shots, the other spot for 20 shots, and do blocked practice like that. Or if you have a random assignment that anywhere on this grid, you have to be able to take a shot and learn how to make the basket. So it's harder to do random learning, but oftentimes the literature shows that the result is you have a deeper learning for what's actually the task, and it's more robust in the face of variation. So you have the ability to respond to a high variability environment and still perform the same task. So basketball is one of the examples we use because it's a very obvious success thing. If you've done it well, it went through the hoop. If you did it poorly, it missed. And you can judge how far it missed and kind of get a gradation or error correction from that. Another example is darts. If you throw darts at a board, there's a target, right? If you say the perfect score is the target in the middle, and everything outside of that is still hitting, so that's good. But if you're tasked with hitting one thing, then you have a measurement of error. And so it's easy to then give feedback as an example to someone. So then when we had the neurophysiologist define what was computer science's term of control theory, this was their definition. So you can see the neurophysiologist was more about words and less about diagrams in their description, and the computer scientist was happy with the diagrams and used a lot less words. So the neurophysiologist said control theory is control of a system, the plant is what they called the system, and the output, as well as the reference, that can be fixed or changing by using a controller to compare it. So it's a little bit hard to understand what they mean by that. But if we break it down a little bit more, you can have a system which incorporates basically the ability to drive the signal, and that drive the signal that generates some output. But then you need to compare that to some reference, and that reference can be either fixed or changed based on what they think the system actually needs to do, and it's all controlled by some change device that actually is deciding whether or not to make a correction. So this is their definition. And they were basing it on a few references about dynamical systems and how you need to have some stability of a dynamical system, but once the dynamical system gets unstable, can you correct it back to a stable system? That was generally their approach in this case. So it was interesting, again, for a neurophysiologist to kind of go out to this end of that perspective. And then they also hit on the same ideas that you can have linear situations. They brought out more that you can have deterministic or time invariant systems. So deterministic meaning maybe fully determined structure where there's no room for variation. It's a fully described structure. You can have something that does not matter if it's happening at a certain point in time or certain events of the overall environment. Or you can have something that's responsive to continual time response. So then they start talking about you have a system then where comparing it to what human can be doing, you can then be collecting information about this with the EEG and take this into a brain-computer interface model. And so they talked about, well, you need to make sure you know what the laws of the structure are, what data is going to be driving it, and set aside some training set, and that you can go from the level of brain-computer interfaces derived or interpreted from EMG, so more of a distal response to what the brain's drive is, or we can go to EEG, as Professor Joshi was just talking about in the previous talk. So you can get closer to the source of the intent, or further away from the source. And so then the complexity of what your sensors actually are to make this happen is also important to consider, as we've just heard recently. About EMG, maybe you only have 2 or 3 sensors that you need. For EEG, you might need the full 64 sensor cap to get the same strength of the signal. So it improves the quality perhaps, but also increases the complexity. So then the last thing that they brought out was in neurophysiology, motor learning is often talked about in this top model here. So just try to ignore the bottom one for a moment. So something that's referred to as an efferent copy, where the efferent signal is coming from the motor cortex out to the muscles to actually say, do your firing, make the tension, move the human, right? So that's the motor command going out. The idea with an efferent copy is that efferent command is stored for a moment, and then once the sensory system picks up what actually happened and gives feedback back to the brain, that the processing about whether it was good or bad or indifferent happens in the cerebellum, and then that feeds back to the premotor and the motor cortex to say, double check what was in the cache of the efferent copy and compare that against this error signal I'm telling you about. And now I want you to do this new thing to try to correct that attempt you just made. So the way that works often then is there's a motor command that's put out into the system, and there's a stored copy of that. And then with the stored copy, the idea is that the brain has a prediction about what's going to happen based on the fact that that signal is sent out to the muscles. But then the sensory motor system actually is the actuator of this case and the sensory system of the case. And then this provides actual sensory feedback to be compared against the predicted feedback that the system thought it was going to get. And then this comparator here is essentially where the cerebellum is doing most of its work. So then the idea is that there's a discrepancy that's then fed back into the whole cycle again to have another motor command that's coming out. So this is very traditional neurophysiology, motor control, motor learning approaches. Then just compare that against what the computer scientists basically came up with their initial model. So this neurophysiology student came up with the same model here after thinking through what the motor control approach was and the other structures and systems that she'd been thinking about. So then she came up with this approach where she said, well, I think there's a controller that has some output to the system, which then has an output to the world. There's some sensor that's actually detecting what's going on there, and then it gives some feedback to an error correction device, which then goes back in. So it's really interesting for us to have this little thought experiment with these 2 different types of students and see what was common between them and what was the difference between them. So perhaps you've already been thinking about this, but some of the things that we found to be in difference between the 2 students was the use of the terminology. So sometimes they use the same terms to describe the same aspect of the system. Other times they had terms that each other didn't recognize. And they would have to explain to each other, this is what I mean. And the person would say, oh, that's the cache. That's Efferent's copy. I understand now what you mean by that. So we had to have some sessions where those two students basically diagrammed the models and then redefined everything based on what the other person's terminology was. It became a very nice exercise to try to get the two of them to understand each other. And with the idea, in the end, that to do this task here of having humans learn some new motor learning ability to be able to control the robotic structure or the new prosthetic limb, the neurophysiologist might be really good at understanding how to coach the person to do that. But computer scientists that might be designing the error correction and the machine learning approach of the new smart adaptive prosthetic, they might not understand what the neurophysiologist is asking them. So we want them to be able to communicate about the human saying, look, the device is very nice, it makes me run faster, it makes me do these things, but there's something about it that's making my muscles sore or tired here. The neurophysiologist might say, oh, that's because you're overcorrecting the system and you're compensating with more musculature, more activation to co-activate and constrain that limb so it doesn't have this weird sensation. Then the machine learning experts or the error correction experts from the computer science perspective can take that information and say, oh, you're saying we're overcorrecting this system. Okay, I will just kind of moderate my transfer function for that error correction, or try this other approach that has more inhibition signal in it instead of an amplification signal. So we wanted them to begin talking in this way to come up with these kind of complementary models. So at this stage, I wanted to show you what the students had come up with because I thought it was intriguing. But I would like then, if you're willing, to share back a little bit about what is your perspective about these two different models we've been talking about. Are you coming from more of a motor learning neurophysiology perspective, or are you coming from more of a computer science, adaptive, computer engineering sort of approach? And does any of this ring true to you? Like, yes, that's exactly how I think. And that person described it in a way I would never have figured out. So is anyone willing to share any thoughts on this? You know, it's the end of the day, and there's a party apparently going on outside. So. This is a challenge to draw people out, okay?
Yeah, but when you talk about the predictor model, whether it is forward prediction, it is positive predictions, or it is accuracy.
So in the motor learning approach, the predictor is thought to be forward, so it's not a recursive system. So the idea is that there's already a map internalized in the brain that it says, I will do this thing and will result in this outcome. It's quite a bit of theory if that's actually what's happening in the brain, but there's been multiple tests done to show that if you give a situation where there's a mispredicted situation, the mechanics may still work out, but the brain thought it was actually giving a totally different signal. So I'm guessing the majority of you from this room would be coming from more of the machine error correction and adaptive control perspective. Is this true? Safe to assume? Okay. So considering what we've been talking about, is there anything new that you would consider to add into the design of your controllers? Or do you think the machine learning, I'm sorry, we're starting using the same terms. Do you think the human motor learning models, ideas, that those are similar enough to what you're already doing with control theory that there's no need to update them? Or is there something you could potentially adapt from the motor learning perspective? Does it make sense what I'm asking? It's maybe not an easy answer.
You said the learning, the importance of learning is effectively nowadays very well handled. The learning is not properly handled. I think
Yes, okay.
So only since I could see a very interesting model you have shown. You have two sensory outputs,
Yeah.
and you have a learning parameter which is alpha or any learning rate, which in turn update your mechanics
Right.
that it acts as a catch.
Yes, yes. So one thought we've had is to try to take these two models, essentially these two here, and draw them out into these two circles and see, is there any shared components where we can take advantage of this simplistic overlap model here? So is there any interface naturally between what the human loop is doing and what the machine loop is doing? So do you see any places where these two models could actually share the same component or have the actual handshake where the two of them are touching and transferring information?
So can we call such mechanism as HLM, hardware and output mechanism, since I have original model and trying to adapt with the model, learning the parameters, getting out, feeding it, accessing whatever, so it becomes the HLM.
Okay. So I'm not sure if it's equivalent to what you're describing, but from the biomechanics side, we've begun discussing that the use of these assistive devices can be described if we assume that the human is going to be the master of the device, but we also need to have the design of the device consider the human. So they decided to start calling this idea human in the loop. So human in the loop optimization. So if you have a learning option for the device where it begins to optimize based on some preconceived notion of what's optimal, that if the human system is looped into that, then it will be an optimization that actually includes what the human wants. So that's getting close to what we've been talking about with this in the past several years. How to actually integrate that is a challenge for sure. So what do you think about the similarity between, let's go back. So this cache idea compared to the comparator, the sensory discrepancy, or this Efferent Copy. Do you think that those things are equivalent enough that we could begin modeling them and kind of parallel with each other? Maybe. This is where I think the overlaps can be, is that the human has an idea, tries it out, senses whether it was good or not, has some error correction going on. The machine tries something out in response to what the human wants, measures it, senses whether it was good or not, does some error correction. So then within this space could be error correction that is kind of both of them working together in a way that the update about what the stored cache was or what the Efferent Copy was, that is updated and compared against each other, not just within the human brain where the human says, I compare what I thought I was going to do with what I actually did. Now I need to update that with some improved system. How to do this, I have no idea. But we're talking about, is there a way to have the error correction modeling going on in the motor learning side and the error correction of the machine to have those two things be in complement with each other and not basically, the thing we're trying to avoid is that the two systems are working at odds with each other. So if the prosthetic foot is trying to make my life easier, but then I become lazy and don't know how to use it, that's not good. But if prosthetic foot says, well, I'll make it easy for you for a while, and then the next day I'm going to make it challenging again because I want the relationship. I want to have an interaction about, does this work better for you? Does it not? And it's not asking me that personally, but can I learn how to shape the motor learning approach of the human to give some indirect feedback back to the machine learning approach? Which is kind of a dream we have and an idea. It's a little bit out there, a little bit crazy perhaps, but if you have any thoughts that come from this idea and it helps you design the controllers to be more inclusive of the actual biological system, then I think it's a benefit. That's kind of my whole goal in sharing this approach. Part of this also is to lead into the next couple of days when we're starting to talk about using neural feedback to drive games. So the idea of a neuro game therapy approach where you can get some feedback back to the patient about how they're doing in their performance based on how they interact with the game that's on the computer screen. So with that, we started talking about instead of a machine like a prosthesis, you have a game interface that's learning how you play the game. And then you learn how to play the game based on how the game is learning how you play the game. It starts to become this thing that's cycling together. So I think this approach is interesting in both just the interaction with any gaming interface but also could be very useful for assistive devices if we can make the device smart enough and figure out what aspect of the human sensory system could be patched into that device as well. So perhaps it's movie science fiction stuff, but I think it could be very practical application in the future. Okay, that's the thought experiment I have for you to think about. You can go enjoy your evening and think about this or not. And maybe tomorrow it will come back to you after you've retained the information and transfer it to the new task. So, all right, great. Are there questions? Yes.
Sir, I wanted to ask, is it like with a controller system working together alongside the physiological motor control, is it possible for the human-machine relationship to form a feedback loop where the prosthetic or the neuroprosthetic achieves an efficiency of almost 100%?
That's the end goal, I suppose. Yes, I think so. I don't know if 100% is always realistic, but my goal, I think, in thinking this way is that you can improve the efficiency of it so that the human is actually benefiting from that experience also, so that metabolic cost to use the device is going down because they're more efficiently using the device and not fighting against the device. That's one outcome that can come from it for sure. The other aspect about this that we didn't talk about is, and that's a similarity between the two. So the human updates what they've learned. Usually it's described as you update your information overnight while you're sleeping. So you incorporate that new experience and deploy it the next day, which is why it's important to sleep, right? But maybe the machine sleeps a little bit too. In other words, it's actually updating its code based on what it learned from that day. So if you have a robust enough design for the controller, there may be room for new information to adjust the expectations for the next day rather than just have an error correction. So that's an idea that we think would be really interesting, is that overnight, over the weekend, the device figures out what to challenge the human with the next week, or how to best fit the human's expectations.
Thank you, sir.
Other questions?
Sir, representation is about randomness.
We can talk more about that.
Yeah.
So the question is about the use of randomness in motor learning. So we've actually done this a fair amount with having humans walk on a split belt treadmill, where you can drive one treadmill belt faster than the other, and it induces a very challenging mechanical task for the human to stay upright and stay walking somewhat symmetrically, even though one belt may be driving 50% faster than the other belt. And so what we played with is you can give them blocked experiences of that, or you can increase the difference between the belts in a linear fashion, or you can randomly change the speed of the belt so that every foot strike is a different experience. And with that, what we found was the random situation was extremely challenging for the person, but it did very well the next day because you basically have challenged them to explore all of the options. And so it's not fun while they're experiencing that, but the next day when they get tested again, they have a very robust response to that. So one thing we found sometimes is the range of the randomness can be too large. So you can over-perturb the person. So then I came up with the idea you can have a random block protocol. You've got, say, out of 0 to 100 options, you pick randomly the first 20 of those, and then work within that 20, and then jump to the 80 to 100 and work between that range. So you have variation, but in small doses. So I think it's important to incorporate that. Also, the more random exposure occurs in there, I think that mathematically that helps with the dynamical systems approach. That you have a cyclic system that's very robust, very stable, but if it ever experiences something that's off of that, it could become unstable permanently. So if you have a little bit of variation, occasionally it will win. What's the goal for that? I don't know if I can answer that. Yeah, I think stability in our definition is not just the ability to always stand up, but the ability to catch yourself when it's about to break. So in the human structure, we define that as I'm not just rigidly standing, but I'm flexible enough to catch myself when the instability occurs. So if there is instability, it should be only for a short time period. Okay, any other thoughts? All right, we can discuss more later or tomorrow as you like, or you can forget about all this stuff. It's just crazy talk. Yeah, so we can talk about more mechanics tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
What is the journal discussion? Last time, I do the hard copy. Complete hard copy. Go to it.
Thanks for your questions. I'm intrigued by this. I think not everyone is. So. Yeah, that drives a lot of research. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Sorry, tomorrow two papers, two journal discussion. Third and first.
How's it going? Is it working? Nice. Okay. So that's why you're asking. But I think in reality, the use is a recursive approach. So, yeah, I think so. Fast. Yeah. Yeah. So that we're really interested to try it out. We developed a few mathematical models to replicate it for each joint of a body. So they go on both sides, and each of them is like its own controller stick. Yeah. It's simplified. That's one of the important things when it's sort of used as a simple description. So, yeah, I think it helps with just general energetics for walking. But then they're a little more happy with this spring damper model that I remember having a fixed mass. But then the path is spring on them, but also damper. So it explains more running mechanics that we use. So we use that quite a lot to define some of the most numbers. Yeah,
Actually, I submitted the you didn't say that. Actually, submitted for correction. Name, college name, and signature. No.
Thanks so much. Okay. Well, feel free to keep in touch.